Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Study Hall with Founder of the Day, where we go through your questions about the American Revolution. So as I'm starting off here, please definitely put some questions in the description or in the comments below because I'll be happy to answer them. Now's your time. Few quick updates. First of all, I am doing a little bit of an experiment this week where I'm just going to start going live at 8:15 each night instead of releasing the pre-recorded videos 3 days a week. I already going live 3 days a week. Why not just go live every day? It'll save me a ton of time between recording, downloading, uploading. So it'll just be a whole lot easier for me, which will free up time for me to do more research and make my articles better. Work on the actual YouTube channel a little bit more behind the scenes and things like that. So thank you for your patience. Hopefully it works out. Tomorrow, our first new live episode is with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast, who is going to talk about one particular founder involved with the early Continental Navy, some of his troubles and tribulations in bringing the war directly to Britain. So I extremely look forward to that. Michael was on the podcast, was on the show over the summer. But now that I've upgraded, it should look a lot nicer this time. We can have another conversation. So hopefully you're going to enjoy that. I'm in contact with several other people. I think there'll only be one interview this week, but in the coming weeks, it looks like I might actually have more than one interview in certain weeks because I'm getting a lot of positive responses to people who like the American Revolution, know a lot about it, and want to talk to you people. Ginger and Matt, hi, thank you for coming. Like I said, let me know you have any questions, anything regarding any of the founders this week, or literally anything. I'll be happy to talk about it. I do want to note, so I'm doing the readings of the week. There is this Edward Wigglesworth. A few of you really like the name Wigglesworth, and then I believe it was Misfit put the article up from Journal of the American Revolution, which if you like my articles, Journal of the American Revolution posts something like once or twice a week, and they do really well-researched, thorough articles. Granted, they have a whole lot more than just one contributor, but they do great work over there. And they did want to, I think it was Ashley and Misfit were both very excited to learn about Edward Wigglesworth. The article was extremely interesting for several reasons, but I did want to point out, I looked into it a little bit. There were actually two Edward Wigglesworths from Massachusetts. Now, it's not necessarily uncommon for people to have similar names, especially if they were distant cousins. I've run into many people with exactly the same name just because their families, like James Madison. James Madison was president of the United States when his cousin James Madison was president of the College of William and Mary. It's probably the most famous example because James Madison's cousin was president of one of the top, I'd say, top three colleges in the young United States by the time he became president, and in the colonies beforehand. So the other Edward Wigglesworth seems to have been, he was Hollis Chair of Divinity at Divinity School from 1765 to 1792. So throughout the entire revolution, when some of these revolutionaries were just graduating college 10 years beforehand, well through until their kids were graduating college from Harvard University, a different Edward Wigglesworth than the one we were talking about seems to have been, unless it is the same person. I don't believe it is. No, because one was a merchant. That's right. The one we read about was a merchant, and this other Edward Wigglesworth was essentially the, I guess you would say, head of religion for not all of New England, but the higher educated elites of Boston society. This was the gentleman who would have ran. I guess I can't say ran the religion. God was up there doing that, I would assume. But yeah, so I thought you guys might find that interesting. That there was just another there were two Edward Wigglesworths. It's a really hard name to say. Now, as for the other one that we read about, I found out there was a lot of really interesting stuff. Now, it focused a lot on his diary, of course, but I noticed when I was going through the description of his life, it had said how he was part of the Massachusetts. He was an officer, a colonel in the Massachusetts militia, And what's interesting about this is he goes to New York. Essentially, the Massachusetts militia took Fort Ticonderoga when they invaded New York, as many people in New York saw it, especially in the area where there was already a little bit of, I don't call it warfare, but there were skirmishes involving Vermont at the time, between not just New York and New Hampshire, but Vermont and New York and Vermont and New Hampshire, because everyone thought Vermont was theirs, and it ended up becoming Vermont's at the time. I think it's hard to say. It is really hard to say who really could lay claim to it. It seems to New York seemed to think they owned it, and then Vermont, what's it called? New Hampshire was the one giving out land grants to the people who moved there, saying they were from New Hampshire, and kind of decided they were Vermont. And what's interesting is these militiamen were called levies. So militiamen didn't have to serve outside their state, but they would. And a levy was a militia unit that was essentially loaned to the Continental Army. And Wigglesworth was leading one of these militia units, served under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Really interesting, he served at the Battle of Valker, which is arguably the first American naval battle, arguably, which the Americans lose, but they manage to escape. And it's a very interesting story. But again, they just kind of literally built the Navy on the shores of Lake Champlain and went for it. And I see Matt saying New York and Massachusetts have border issues also. Yeah, essentially everyone had border issues at this time. One of the reasons not only the Articles of Confederation was signed, but one of the reasons they gave for needing a constitution and a federal government to have someone to regulate these disagreements. At the time, King and Parliament were in charge of regulating it, but that was a arduous process, getting them the maps, getting everything certified. New York had border issues with a lot of people. Everyone had border issues because they all had different charters in the first place. Some of them were royal colonies. Some of them were private, corporate-owned entities. And because of this, their different charters often coupled, different charters that were 150 years old from a time where most of this land wasn't surveyed. As we've talked about, like Thomas Jefferson's dad was out there surveying Virginia and gave the first really good detailed map of Virginia as an example. And this was 20 years before the Revolution, but 150 years after Virginia was starting to be settled. It's a lot of land. It took a lot of time to learn what was going on. Interestingly, too, Connecticut and Pennsylvania had border disputes, which I know doesn't make sense now because there's New York and some New Jersey in between the two, but Connecticut's original grant basically laid out the Connecticut we know now, except it continued on to the Pacific Ocean, essentially. Which we know now Connecticut doesn't go to the Pacific Ocean, but it did. Pretty quickly, New York was like, no, we're over here, and Connecticut was fine, but we also own what's on the other side of New York. So first of all, this would become a problem because if you look at a map, that's northern Pennsylvania, and the northeastern section of Pennsylvania, known as the Wyoming Valley, Connecticutites, not Canucks. That's Canada. Some Connecticutiers, until I'm corrected, I'm going with that, because I really like that. They went and settled the area as Connecticut, and then some Pennsylvanianites went up there and settled the area as Pennsylvanianites. And they actually came to blows a few times because of these disagreements. This would kind of get settled during the Revolution. It'd be put on hold, and then there would be a massacre, the Wyoming Valley Massacre, where the Native Americans, Joseph Brant, came down and just kind of cleared everyone out, for a while there, and then afterward, before the war is even ending, it gets tense again, and then there are not battles, not like outright battles, skirmishes between people from Connecticut and people from Pennsylvania during the Continental Congress in like the first few years of under the Articles of Confederation, before there's even a Constitution. And again, so when they're writing the Constitution, they're like, okay, this is an interstate dispute. We need a better body than like the people to solve this problem. Furthermore, Connecticut would still be a problem in the Ohio Valley because, as we've talked about, you have people like Moses Cleveland was from Connecticut when he went out to settle Cleveland, which was being claimed by Connecticut. And simultaneously, Ohio was being claimed by Pennsylvania, and simultaneously, Ohio was being claimed by Virginia. And so, again, first of all, that's one of the reasons they came out with the Northwest Ordinance. Well, I should say, even before that, you have George Rogers Clark captures all this land, and Maryland refuses to sign the Articles of Confederation until Virginia cedes that land, because it was the Virginia militia conquered all this property. So Virginia was claiming all this land, making it 3 times as big as any other state. And then, fortunately, they're like, okay, we'll cede it to the government. And then Maryland signs the Articles of Confederation. A few years later, they come out with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And then, furthermore, the Constitution to settle all these problems, because they were serious problems. And I do see Elisha Kramer, Connecticutians and Pennsylvanians. Pennsylvanians I knew. My grandparents lived in Pennsylvania growing up. So I'm just being a little bit silly. I also live not very far from the Pennsylvania border. Connecticutians? Pennsylvanians, you could say. Connecticutians. Yeah, no, it doesn't. I'm gonna starting now, we're changing it to Connecticutiers. It just feels right. It's the T. Connecticutiers. It flows properly. Sorry, Connecticut. You've been changed. So Eastern New Yorkers. Connecticut. Yeah, the greater New York area. that part of the nation. So I got a little off track from Wigglesworth, but border disputes are very just fascinating. And a lot of the people who make their name make it settling border disputes. We talked about recently, and this isn't necessarily how he made his name, but James Sullivan helped settle the border in northern New York. Northern Maine. The gentleman, of course, name escapes me, and I'm going to pull it up. Andrew, something with a B, I believe. I'm going to type in survey into founderoftheday.com, where you can find all of my articles. Andrew Williamson. I think the name was Andrew Ellicott. Okay, Andrew Ellicott finalized the shape of the United States. This gentleman, Andrew Ellicott, doesn't get nearly enough credit because he literally travels. First of all, the Mason-Dixon line was started just before the Revolutionary War, but the people, about a decade before, but the people who were surveying it ran into some Native Americans who wanted them to stop, and they did. But Andrew Ellicott goes down, he finishes the Mason-Dixon line, he helps survey Erie, Pennsylvania, and settle that border dispute between New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio, which was, again, Connecticut, and also maybe Virginia. And this is in 1784, so just as the war is ending, he's doing this. He goes down, he helps to survey parts of Washington, D.C. Pierre L'Enfant was obviously the architect of Washington, D.C., but Andrew Ellicott was part of the L'Enfant team that surveyed and laid the stones, and there are still stones that Andrew Ellicott laid around Washington, D.C. I've never gone and found them, but there are videos you can find online of people who go. If you really get that deep into it, I have, people actually go find the stones around D.C. laying out the parameters. He went down south for a while and dealt with New Spain, aka Spanish territory in the southwest, and it's weird, he acted as part diplomat, part surveyor, because he was negotiating the boundaries that were being surveyed as they went. And this was very early in the United States, and Spain at this point was not being super cool. And before Lewis and Clark went on before Meriwether Lewis set out with William Clark on their nationwide adventure, or soon-to-be nationwide adventure, he went and stayed for several weeks with Ellicott, who had, by this point, surveyed most of the the United States. So he was a major advisor. He didn't go on the trip. By this point, I've quickly gone through life. Surveying takes a long time, and I've mentioned a bunch of surveys that all took years individually. So as an older man, he advised Meriwether Lewis on certain ways to go about choosing equipment, prepping, food storage and things like that. He was also at the end of his life, he went to survey the border between Georgia and North Carolina. And I know there's supposed to be a South Carolina in there, but if you look at a map, Georgia and North Carolina, I don't know if they touch anymore. If they do, it's just a little bit. But before there was a Tennessee and an Alabama, Georgia and North Carolina touched. South Carolina, it's interesting, kind of already had its boundaries set by Georgia and North Carolina by the time the Revolution had started. And then, at the end of his life, he goes up and does the New York-Canada border. So Andrew Ellicott, and there's an Ellicottville, I know in New York, like you see Ellicotts around the nation, especially on the eastern half of the country. If there's an Ellicott, there's like a 99% chance it's named after this gentleman who kind of settled all the disagreements. There were more. Obviously, the country would get bigger. There would be many disagreements. But on the eastern half, this side of the Mississippi, this side of the Mason-Dixon. You ever heard that phrase? You get that phrase from Andrew Ellicott. And, you get it from Mason and Dixon. To be fair to them, though Mason and Dixon, like I said, didn't finish it, Andrew Ellicott finished it. A ginger thrown in all the stones but one have been found. Okay, I'm not the only one who's dug into the stones. I don't know. I doubt they'll find that last one. It's probably either broken or stolen or who knows. I could talk a lot about surveying, believe it or not. Surveying was a very great way for people to earn their way up in society. Like, for example, I believe Rufus Putnam, brother of Israel Putnam, who's a little more famous. Rufus Putnam worked as a surveyor and made a little bit of a name for himself, and then would go to Connecticut. Would go to found Marietta, Ohio, which again kind of seemed like it was Virginia at the time, though Connecticut thought it was Connecticut. So that whole the group of associates went. It was mostly people from Connecticut who went to found Ohio, essentially, in Marietta, and then, like I said, also up north in Cleveland was named after Moses Cleveland, although it was spelled incorrectly. He had an A in there. George Washington started out as a surveyor. Rufus was from Massachusetts. You're right. I apologize, Matt. You're right. I blanked on that. Right. Israel was living in Connecticut. Rufus was from Massachusetts. Thank you for correcting me. So what happens when I talk on the fly like this? Though I do believe most of the people who went with the associators were from Connecticut. You have Meigs. Man, I'm drawing a lot of blanks. Sutton, Massachusetts. Very specific. Thank you, Matt. Although I will say they did get permission from the Continental Congress to settle the area, because by the time they went out there, it was after the Revolutionary War, and as I said, it was during the war that Maryland refused to sign the Articles of Confederation until that land was technically turned over to the, I don't want to say federal government, the Continental Congress, the confederated government, so to speak, because of that. So technically, by the time they're settling that, by the time Moses Cleveland goes to Cleveland with his team, by the time Putnam and Meigs and others go to Marietta with their team, that land was officially owned by the Continental Congress. So it wasn't, when I say kind of Ohio, kind of Connecticut, kind of Virginia, kind of Pennsylvania, that was really before the Revolution. Once the Revolution starts, they drop it for a while. And then when the issues start coming back up, as I said, it's the Continental Congress essentially takes over. Except the Wyoming Valley. Like I said, there were some skirmishes between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, like technically during the Revolutionary War. And what's interesting is well before the Revolutionary War, these things happen a lot more frequently. It's one of the several reasons, much like there are several reasons they wrote the Constitution, there were several reasons that in 1754, 20 years before the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin had his famous Albany Conference, where they called to Albany, New York, delegates from several states, or colonies at the time. Not all of them showed up, but several. I want to say 6 or 7, and they were. One of the reasons was to settle border disputes. The main reason was, hey, the French and Indian War is breaking out. We need to work together as a team to defend ourselves. Again, that didn't happen. Nothing he wanted happened at that point, but it did set the foundation for 20 years later, the Revolutionary War. They did work together in much the same way with their militias. The thing is, the real difference is it was the British Army and then state militias coordinating together, colonial militias coordinating together, versus the Continental Army and state militias coordinating together. Take a quick sip of water here. As I said, if you guys have any questions, I also want to note, so I have been considering, since I'm doing my live experiment this week, I have been considering relocating the week in review from Wednesday until Sunday. I'm not certain about that yet. Let me know your opinion on that. I would really like to know, because if I'm going live all week, I could just do one founder each day all week. It will also free up Wednesdays for certain guests who want to come chit-chat with us, who might otherwise be occupied. And also, it is the end of the week, which makes more sense. We got fun Rufus Putnam fact. He owned a house in Rutland, Massachusetts that was used to house officers captured from Saratoga. Very cool. It's now a B&B. That's cool. I want to own that B&B. That makes a lot of sense. After Saratoga, General Heath, who actually is today's founder, technically, he was put in charge of what was called the Convention Army. The Convention Army was an army made up of the entire captured British force at Saratoga. And they were first brought to Massachusetts. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were many houses used to house officers there. But if Putnam wasn't the top of the elite chain, but he had made his way pretty far up to the top of the middle class, if I can say that. A very untechnical term for the time. But Putnam made his way up. So he wouldn't have been an elite person whose house couldn't be tainted with prisoners. But as we've said recently, officers were treated much better than your common people. Your common soldiers, your privates, even your sergeants. Officers were treated better, and the higher up you were, the better you were treated. We said the other day about Charles Lee, for example. Charles Lee was an American. When he was captured, he was hanging out having tea with the generals. Meanwhile, his men were dying on prison ships of starvation and disease. It's quite a radical change. Again, the Americans tried to be better. They wanted to demonstrate to their supporters, to the patriots, look, we are not stooping to their level. Of course, not always the case, but so it doesn't surprise me at all that Putnam's house would have been used as a holding cell for that point. Rutland had a POW barracks. Interesting. It was a Tory house that Rufus bought. Okay, so there was some taken loyalist land, and Putnam bought it, and then I'm assuming Putnam was at war, so he didn't really need it a ton. Again, that's an assumption. Not sure. Maybe you can confirm that, Matt. But I would assume he wasn't around, so he was like, yeah, use my house. If he was around, it's like, okay, they're officers, and they've acknowledged defeat. They can have tea with me in my house, because they were officers. And officers were cool like that with each other. There was a lot of respect there. What's interesting too is so the Convention Army, as they called it, which was the captured Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, was brought to Massachusetts, where they were held in Boston for a while. And this didn't work out great because it was easy for them to escape and things of that nature. They had a lot more trouble keeping an eye on them than, for example, the British had in New York City. To be fair, Manhattan's an island, but still. Also, the British had prison ships to keep them prisoners on, which helped a lot. So eventually, they go to, it's not Edward Hand, Theodoric Bland. Bland, they rhyme. Theodoric Bland actually is put in charge of the Convention Army and marches them hundreds of miles from Boston to Charlottesville, Virginia. And although there were people who escaped, Theodoric Bland was kind of applauded for his ability to move thousands of soldiers on foot. And not just soldiers, thousands of prisoners on foot across the United States. And then actually oversaw the prison for a little bit. He ends up leaving, claiming ill health. It's hard to tell. Back then, a lot of people leave for what they call ill health. There were a lot of sicknesses around that they had no idea what was going on. I think it seems to be a little bit, although they were men of honor, it seems to have been a convenient excuse to take a break after years of war, to use the commonly true issue of ill health as alright, let me get out of here. Because, like many of soldiers, Theodoric Bland would leave for a while and then come back. Kind of fine. So maybe he was sick. I don't know. I should look more into Theodoric Bland. He's a really interesting character. An equestrian, if I'm not mistaken, one of the more important people leading the thing. Let me see. I believe he ran a cavalry. He obviously wasn't Pulaski or Kovacs, who we talked about recently. He's best known for leading the Convention Army. Yes, cavalry. He was an equine enthusiast. That's why I thought cavalry. That's right. I'm reading my own article to remind myself. Theodoric Bland was requested by George Washington because he was also a Virginian. They knew each other, and he was known as a really good horseman. He was requested by Washington to raise a cavalry. Arguably one of the first cavalries. There were obviously continental colonial cavalries of that nature. But he raised the first one for the Continental Army. It was absorbed into the Continental Army, became the first Continental Light Dragoons. They were super important, mostly as scouts for Washington. Now, again, as we talked about Kovacs. I talked about Kovacs in a video recently. Pulaski and to a little bit of a lesser degree Kovacs came over from Europe and really organized what was then a contemporarily modern cavalry as it was used at the time. The Continental Army did have a cavalry for a little bit there. I see you, Tarrant. I'll respond to that in a second. The Continental Army did have a cavalry. It was essentially the first one organized by Theo Bland, and they were really important. Washington, here's a quote. I have a quote here, actually. George Washington once said, Theodoric Bland had some prisoners, and he was moving slowly with the prisoners, but Washington told him to leave the prisoners behind, leave the prisoners and continue, because he said, I quote, would not have a horseman left behind, which indicates how important Washington thought the cavalry actually was. And then when Pulaski shows up knowing about cavalries, he's like, all right, you take over, because again, by that point, Bland had moved over to this other thing, and then Bland does go to Congress. I think he's an inaugural member of, was an inaugural original representative of Virginia in the United States House of Representatives. Tarrant, yes, mental health is still health. No, they did not think that way back at the time. Although Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's going to be part of this week's reading, thank you, Matt, for finding it. I'll put that out later. Dr. Benjamin Rush is one of the first people to start classifying in different language, certainly, but he's really the father of American psychiatry, and was one of the first people to really consider mental health as a type of health. Matt, so they say George was a great horseman, so to impress him, he must have been good. Yes, absolutely. I'm assuming Geo is George Washington. Ricketts. Bill Ricketts. He was impressed by horsemen. Most of the people at the time rode horses. That's how you got around. Either on a horse or in a carriage being pulled by a horse. And Washington was known to be superior. It's almost like today where we drive cars. You know who's a better driver than other people. And George Washington was one of the better drivers on the road. So for George Washington to say, you, here's a race car, get on the track, it definitely indicates that he knew what was going on. And I said the name John Bill Ricketts because these people like to be entertained, especially after the war, especially after the Constitution was written. And what do you know, lo and behold, a few years after April of 1793, George Washington went to the circus. Now, the circus wasn't the circus we know it today, but the inklings were there. There was a gentleman named John Bill Ricketts. John Bill Ricketts was an Englishman who came to the United States seeing opportunity just after independence, and he started with the seeds of what we now know as the circus. Now, it was mostly horse tricks. John Bill Ricketts would do all sorts of horse tricks. He'd put a egg on a spoon in his mouth and ride on the horse. He would do a trick where I think it was his grand finale, is he would have one foot, he'd have two horses riding, he'd have one foot on each horse, and then he'd jump, they'd be riding towards a hoop, and he'd jump through the hoop and land back on the horses. Whew, that's a show. And I'm just glazing over the article here. No, oh, that's right. What I think is his most impressive, or what I wrote the article, what I thought was the most impressive. Not only would he ride two horses side by side, he'd take two eggs and he'd put two eggs under each foot, and stand on the eggs on the horses while he rode. Now, I mean, they didn't have instant replay like we have today. He probably just curled his foot around the eggs, but still, super impressive. So, yeah, John Bill Ricketts, unfortunately, his story ends kind of sadly. He ends up he travels around, he spends a while in Philadelphia, then travels around the United States, and then he goes down to the islands in the Caribbean, and then, this is during the quasi-war with France, it seems like his ship was captured. His ship was captured by the French, and they keep him in prison for a little bit, but then he puts on a bunch of shows for them, and they're like, okay, man, you're good. And they actually give him some money and buy him a ticket so that he and his horses could return to England. But unfortunately, at just 29 years old, his ship vanishes at sea. Womp, womp, womp. Unfortunately, it's a pretty common occurrence for ships to vanish at sea back then. But yeah, John Bill Ricketts. And, so Washington did, like, I don't know if I have a quote in here, but I remember reading that Washington was very impressed with the show John Bill Ricketts performed. As someone who was a gigantic fan of really good horseback races, I don't know a lot about car racing, but if we're going back to the car analogy, then John Bill Ricketts was the Dale Earnhardt Jr. of horsebacking. Not even. Honestly, it's more like the Joey Chitwood. I don't know if any of you get that reference. Joey Chitwood was a stuntman who had a stunt show who traveled around. I believe it was Elias. I'm sorry if I see your name wrong. Elias, or Elijah, in eastern Pennsylvania, in Wayne County, Pennsylvania. I would growing up go to the Wayne County Fair every summer with my family and my grandparents, and we would always go on Joey Chitwood Day, and they toured the country doing these stunts. So Joey Chitwood at the Wayne County Fair in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, is something I did every August for most of my life. I would love to know if any of you have heard the name Joey Chitwood. He did stunt work in movies. Like I think he was in like Batman Returns. He did all the stunt work for that. Really fun stuff. They tip the car sideways and drive it around the track on 2 wheels. So yes, John Bill Ricketts was the Joey Chitwood of the American founding. Oh my God, no one gets that reference. Cool. Let me know if you guys have any other questions. We talked about mental health a little bit. Yeah, we don't have to push it too long. Like I said, though, let me know. I might next week experiment with this because I'm happy to answer your guys' questions, but I do find myself kind of stalling here for a little bit. Although, like I said, it is fun to like go back through my articles and find people I haven't talked about in a while, and just to talk about the revolution. But to have a more concise outline for the show. Like I said, I'm thinking about testing it out, moving the weekend review here to Sundays, and then just doing Monday through Friday. That way I can do, Monday through Thursday, just do quick either Founder of the Days or interviews, which essentially are Founder of the Days with someone who knows something I don't. And then, of course, Friday, trivia. That's not going to change. But, I don't know. I'm trying things out. I'm trying to make it more conducive convenient for you guys. Trying to find out what you prefer, to be honest. Making it easier on myself is obviously fun. Like I said the other day, one of the reasons I want to keep going live is I kind of have 2 audiences right now. The people who watch the 3 videos that are pre-recorded each week, and those of you who watch these long-form live videos. I appreciate everyone, but to consolidate it into one audience if I can, I think would be really helpful. I will say my weekday videos, even though they're live, are pretty much going to stay the same. I'm going to pop on for like 3 or 4 minutes, tell you about a founder real quick, and then go. If you have a question, it'll be live. You can definitely ask it. But that's essentially how it's going to run, at least this week. We'll see how it goes. I did this experiment once, I think over the summer or right when I got the new setup, but I wasn't prepared for it. Now I've learned a lot about how these work. This all works. Yeah, I'll take a sip of water. If you guys don't have any more questions, we can call it a little bit early today. And like I said, this is kind of why I was thinking about moving the weekly live video till now. The weekly wrap-up till now. Because I'm just hanging around. I mean, I could talk about Liberty & Co. They're just fantastic. And they sponsor our Friday night thing. Trying to get Tyson to come on. He's a little hesitant. I will say he's a fantastic designer and offers great products there at Liberty & Co. But he seems to be a little gun shy to come on the camera. So I'll ask him very nicely. I'm sure he'll come on. Michael Troy is coming tomorrow from the Amarev podcast. What do I know about the Testy of Mort Fontaine? Treaty. Oh, okay. That's an interesting autocorrect, Matt. Treaty of Montfontaine. Treaty of Montfontaine. Is that a Native American treaty? Oh, the Convention of 1800. Oh, but to end the quasi-war that never actually started. It wasn't really a war. I don't know a ton about the treaty. It was it was with Bonaparte. I don't recall who was there. Was Elbridge Gerry there? I think Gerry was still there. The diplomatic commission was approved. Well, okay, Oliver Ellsworth and William Richardson Davey. That's right, Oliver Ellsworth. Man, he did everything, didn't he? I don't know a ton about the treaty. I'll be honest. Obviously, I don't even remember what it's called. The Treaty of Montfontaine. I generally know it as the Convention of 1800. Oliver Ellsworth was basically left being Chief Justice to go do this treaty, which, in relation, John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the United States. and went and did the Jay Treaty. Technically, the second Chief Justice was John Rutledge, but that was brief and didn't end well. And then Oliver Ellsworth stepped in, and it's unlike John Jay, who kept the position, essentially left it to go to Paris and negotiate. Negotiate this treaty. Who else was there? William Richardson Davey. I was just looking at him. He was a governor of North Carolina. Just an important member of the Federalist Party. It does seem to be Federalist, and they were sent by John Adams, and it was right before Thomas Jefferson comes and takes over as president. Essentially, it said, hey, cool. Okay, I'll be honest. There's not a ton I know about that. I should research it. And you know what? There's another name here, William Vans Murray, the third member. I don't know about him. So I'll research William Vans Murray this week, put him in relation to the Convention of 1800, and we'll talk more about it later this week. It's a great question. What I do know about it is that there was never really a war that broke out. A big part of the problem was that France kept having these revolutions. Like, the French Revolution was more like a series of 10 revolutions all within like a few weeks of each other, or a few years of each other. And so this was settled just as Napoleon, I think he had just taken over as consul. Let me look up the years. I believe Napoleon had just taken over as consul, but was not yet emperor. Yes. Right. It's within a year of him taking over as consul. So he was essentially running the show, but wasn't just entirely in charge of the show. But he was quickly consolidating power and like essentially ending the revolution at this time. And one of the ways he wanted to end the revolution was to end the quasi-war with the United States. Now, in the future, Napoleon would consider invading the United States, but that didn't work out for him for several reasons. But he's also simultaneously taking over control of Louisiana from Spain, theoretically. You know, when in a few... Napoleon takes over as consul. Americans send this delegation. They've signed this treaty which says, we didn't really have a war, we were just kind of being mean to each other, so we're going to stop being mean to each other because we've been friends this whole time. And everyone's like, are we cool? Cool. All right, we're cool. And that's essentially what the Treaty of I don't even know how to pronounce it, Montfontaine, that's essentially what the Convention of 1800 concluded, was, hey, guys, come on, we're friends here. But because it was actually really important because it smoothed things over for 2 years later when the Louisiana Purchase is made. Now, again, Napoleon kind of reluctantly did this out of necessity, the Louisiana Purchase, but, you know, these Federalist Americans come in, they say, are we cool? Okay, we're cool. The Federalists leave, Thomas Jefferson becomes president, sends over James Monroe and Robert Livingston, and they show up and they're like, okay, so the Federalists cooled things off, right? Well, now the Democratic Republicans want to talk. All this, so again, usually we're talking about west of the Mississippi on this channel, we're usually talking about Spain, but through European dealings and, you know, Napoleoning the Napoleation of Europe, France takes over this property. He wants it, and he wants to conquer the United States, but realizes he can't, and quickly sells it. In fact, when Americans first go in to New Orleans, they take down the Spanish flag, literally put a French flag on, run it up the pole, run it right back down, take it off and put an American flag on it and run it up the pole, just to demonstrate, yes, this did technically pass through the hands of France, but Spain had control and it went right to America. But because of the Convention of 1800, because of that smoothing out of this quasi-war, again, the war doesn't even have a name. It's a quasi-war because there were some naval battles, but like we weren't really at war with each other. France was at war with all of Europe, more than it was at war with the United States. So, you know, the treaty smoothed it over and opened up the ability and, in a way, the necessity for Napoleon to sell and America to make the Louisiana Purchase. So in that way, it is certainly important. As for the details, you're right. I have kind of overlooked it. Like I said, I will research it more and write more about it, because you look at, like, like I could talk a lot more about the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war, in 14, that ended the War of 1812, because it ended that war. The quasi-war, like, it was like, I guess it's a war? Oh, what's interesting, I should make this comparison. The way France was handled, the way the Louisiana Purchase was handled, the way it passed through France, is almost like, for sports fans out there, when a player gets traded from one team to another, but it's a three-way deal, so technically he passes through Detroit. When New York trades someone to LA, technically they pass through Detroit on their way over, but never played there. Very interesting. Yeah. Someone subscribed. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Make sure you hit like on your way out. So we're at 47 minutes. We're closing on an hour. If you guys have any last questions, now's a great time. If you do, I might not know. Now that Matt is finding out. Can't know everything. Although I should have known the Treaty of Montfontaine. I can't say it. That's part of the problem. Can't say it. I actually took French for several years in high school, and I can't pronounce any of it. I wanted to take Latin, and they didn't offer it. Seems pretty dumb. What are you going to do? Yeah, no problem, Matt. I wish I could give you a more thorough answer. Like I said, I'm definitely going to... I'll look into it, and then we can talk about it at the weekly wrap-up. I don't know, Matt. You give me a run for my money with a lot of these things. That's Napoleon. Yeah, William Vans Murray. I'm gonna see what's up with this guy. He looks a lot of fun. Ooh, doesn't live much longer. 6th Minister to the Netherlands. Okay, interesting. And an early member of the United States House of Representatives. Very interesting. There were a lot of them. Alright, guys, unless you have more Joanna, off topic. I'd love to pick your brain more on an earlier subject. John Price Posey and the new Kent County records. Well, Joanna, that is a great question. John Price Posey grew up with John Parke Custis. John Parke Custis was the stepson of George Washington and the actual son of Martha Washington. Heavy sigh. Let me make sure I get this story straight. So John Price Posey grows up in the household of George Washington. Now, okay, let me rephrase that. His best friend growing up is John Parke Custis, who was stepson and therefore grew up in the house of George Washington. As a neighbor who was best friends with his son, John Price Posey would have spent a lot of time growing up in the Washington household on the estate of Mount Vernon. They grow up, and the Revolutionary War starts, and John Price Posey holds a few lower-level government positions. He's a judge for a while, but mostly he becomes a caretaker for the estate, the Custis estate. The name escapes me, but John Parke Custis, his father obviously had passed away. That's why Martha Washington was a widow before she married George Washington. But when he came of age, John Parke Custis he was to inherit this estate. And he did. But he was away for extended periods of time, especially when he went to help fight in the Revolutionary War. And John Price Posey took care of this estate. And then Custis dies pretty young, unfortunately, just after the Battle of Yorktown, where he volunteered as an aide-de-camp to George Washington. But he had a child, so this property was supposed to go to that child, and John Price Posey was supposed to take care of it. Now, as the war is coming to an end, George Washington has some criticisms of John Price Posey because he was not very good at taking care of the property, and he accused Posey of stealing like cattle and things like that. Posey also seems to have kind of lost. We were talking about mental illness. He seems to start losing some of his mind because he causes trouble in public, he gets into an argument. I don't remember the exact details, but he gets into an argument with a sheriff. He ends up like punching a sheriff or something like that, and he ends up getting put in a prison cell. Now, he's just brought to jail, and he's only supposed to be there like a day, awaiting trial for assault. It's like not really that heavy a crime. And there were a few occasions that he had been brought in. He was, I believe, a justice of the peace for a little while, but then as the years go by, he starts committing these crimes. He falls under the... George Washington doesn't, like him anymore because he's not taking care of this estate of his stepson. And then Posey's put in this prison cell, and he finds a way to break out. And he goes and he gets a friend, and he gets 2 slaves. That's right, man. I did an article on Posey quite a while ago. He gets 2 slaves and a friend, and they go and they burn down 2 buildings. I believe they burn down either the jail or the courthouse. I think the jail they burn down. And then they burn down the New Kent County courthouse, which had all of the records of the history of New Kent County. And I don't know if you know how paper works, but when you burn a building down with paper in it, it gets destroyed. And we've lost, because of this, and this is in the 1780s. This was, I believe, the year before the Constitution is written. If not that year. I think it's the year before it, because he is tried and convicted of arson, and he's hung. Which I believe was in like January or February of 1787, just as Washington's about to go write the Constitution. And it's really, first of all, it's really sad that we lost all these records, because these are all the colonial records. We could have learned so much about the years leading up to and even during the American Revolution that has just vanished because this dude was being a jerk. And on top of that, it's really interesting to see how because, again, John Price Posey knows George Washington. He has friends in literally the highest places, and he writes to them asking to help get him pardoned from being hung. He doesn't want to be hung, and Washington doesn't help him. None of these people help him. First of all, because he burned down the courthouse, and second of all, because mental health was not being taken seriously at that time, which, truthfully, if it was, it would have been his first time in prison that they helped him with his mental capacities. And thirdly, it speaks a lot for the attitudes that people had towards law and order at the time. Now, granted, these people did just throw an insurrection against the king and throw off their government, but the reason for that was they wanted law and order. And you have people looking at, we often point to the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts was a wee bit of lawlessness that many of the American founders were not excited about. And one of the reasons they wanted to write the Constitution was to help suppress that kind of thing. But at the same time, they're nervous about people like John Price Posey walking around burning down courthouses, breaking out of prisons. And they needed to stop this. And to be fair, I keep bringing up Benjamin Rush and mental health, but to Benjamin Rush, one of the reasons he started trending towards thinking about mental health as a sickness was because they were trying to solve these problems. John Price Posey wasn't a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts or New Hampshire rebelling against their local government. This was one person who committed a pretty terrible act. And Dr. Benjamin Rush was trying to figure out, how do we help people stop those? Get people past this? How do we improve people's mental capacities? To be fair, most of Benjamin Rush's solutions were horrifying, but he did, like his actions or not, his motivation was good. And it is where he is, in a very large degree, why not just the United States, but the entire world is where it is, where we think about mental health. Do I believe is a justice of the peace who's trying to destroy the records against him? That's interesting. By the time he burned down the courthouse, he had not been a justice of the peace for quite some time. It'd been like five or 6 years. I don't even think Posey was 30 yet. He was still very young. He was probably about 30 years old. So he was in his early to mid-20s when he was a justice of the peace. But then I believe there was something with records. Let me Posey. I want to look it up. I believe the reason he was kicked out of being a judge was something to do with tampering with records. Posey was accused of embezzling funds from the Custis estate, and stealing a cow. He was convicted. He was convicted of stealing a cow from the Custis estate. So that's why he was taken away from his judgeship. And this is not long. So first Washington accuses him of stealing money. Then he caught and convicted of stealing a cow. And because of this, he's removed from being a justice. And then he's arrested and fined for committing fraud because he destroyed an arbitration bond. Since that was a legal document, destroying it was terrible. So that's in the early 1780s. Oh, and I was mistaken. It was in 1788 that he was arrested. 1787. He was arrested in 1787 and hung January 25th. Oh, tomorrow's the anniversary. 1788. Which means he's actually arrested as they're returning from the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention. But no, I don't think he burned... Okay, so he didn't burn a courthouse. He escaped from the jail. He burned down the jail and the clerk's office. It's hard to say if he was trying to destroy records on himself. That's an interesting... I never considered to look at that. My impression was always he was just angry and did what he thought would do the most damage. Do you know if his actions were taken to try to compile or figure out documents? Do you know if actions were taken to try and compile or find the documents? No. It burned down. So, while the founders, obviously, as I like to say, one of the most exciting things about studying the American Revolution is the American founders documented everything. That being said, I don't think they considered it that important to go through and try and, take bits of paper and put them back together. The county clerk wasn't getting paid that much money to do all that work. And it is sad, fire destroyed a lot of history throughout world history. Fire has always been I'm terrified of it. Fortunately, most of my work is on the interwebs, so it won't get destroyed until all of the power shuts off, which that's for a different channel. I know some good conspiracy channels if you'd like to learn about that. But no, they probably didn't. The first other example that comes to my mind is the Shadwell fire at Jefferson's mom and brother, who we talked about recently, were at. I understand there's a Reconstruction census done. I just thought maybe. A Reconstruction census? Yeah, the thing is, it's so many documents, and that it would be next to impossible to remember. Now, that being said, people went and rewrote their wills. People got new deeds. A lot of the things people needed to, make sure they could prove that this is my house, I own it. They went back and redid that. But as for notes and things, someone went back and tried to remember the other docs. Some of those records might have been previously duplicated. Yeah. Oh, certainly. There were definitely duplicates. However, most people... So when you say Washington kept 3 copies of everything, Washington would have written 3 copies or had one of his secretaries write it. While the clerk's office would have had... The clerk would have had secretaries, certainly. did Washington keep all 3 copies in the same house? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure Washington didn't, but, you know, court documents were supposed to be kept there. I should look a little more into it. I don't know a ton about all the documentation. These are great questions. It's a lot of fun. But I never came across other documents. Well, you know what? Let's look it up. I really don't believe so. Kent County Courthouse burning documents. I will look more into this. A draft, a final one, and one to send. Right. Well, that's true. You know, I heard someone talking. I was watching the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society now as a YouTube channel, which I highly recommend you check out. They were talking about George Washington at Newburgh. I don't know why this reminds me of it. George Washington at Newburgh, where he has the famous quote, is there a piece of dust flying around on me? His famous quote where, like, he takes out his glasses, says, I've grown, you know, not only grown old, but nearly blind in service of my country. Apparently, the secretary wrote this, you know, there was the letter of this that he was going to read. Apparently, he wrote out another copy of it with bigger writing because he had trouble seeing. And then he got up there and couldn't see it anyway. Clerk of New Kent County official website. You know what? I'll try and look into this a little bit more for you guys. No. Okay. No, this is just telling me I need to pay $50, 50 cents per page if I want a copy of a document from the New Kent County Courthouse. I should write them and see if they can give me a copy of the anything that was burned. I wouldn't. Yeah, no. Everything I remember from what I remember from when I wrote this article, which was over a year ago. I only remember seeing that a lot of documents were lost. You would hope that you would hope there were copies, but as I said, there might have been copies. No, because like you only get one will. You know, I guess you could have copies of it, but it wouldn't have been the official will. You can only have one deed to a house. Sure, you could write. I don't even know if you legally could write a copy of a deed to your house. You know what I mean? Like, these are legal documents. They're like official. Yeah. If there are any other questions, we're hitting an hour now, so we should call it soon. But if you have any other questions, here I am. Drinking out my Sweet Liberty and Coke cup. Like and subscribe. The other reason I'm thinking about kind of replacing this video with the weekly one is there's a lot of silence. There's a lot I don't like. I'm happy to not know things. I'm never going to lie to you and say I do know something I don't know. But there's a lot of thinking about it. And I feel like anyone popping in who finds this is like, what? He's not even saying anything. Which kind of adversely affects my channel. Again, so not this week. This week we'll keep it the way it is. See how the live videos go. And then after that, maybe the following week, we'll make some changes. Excuse me. Alright guys, so I am going to head out. I don't remember the sign-off for this particular channel, this particular show. No, Joanna, that's why I was doing these study halls, is I want people to hijack it, and the reason I'm thinking about stopping them is because they're not getting hijacked enough. John Price Posey is a great question. I know a lot about him. I don't know a lot about what happened to the documents after he burned them, but he's a super interesting thing. Someone I know your chat on JPP. So you were live. Yeah, no, my pleasure. Hey, hit like and subscribe. I know I'm saying about I'm making changes, but I put out videos now 6 days a week, all about the American Revolution. Most of them, as you saw, are pretty short. Even though I'm going to start doing them live at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. most of them will still be pretty short, though I have a website. You can check out the link. I think the link's in the description, where I write these articles 5 days a week. And on Wednesdays, I have an hour-long video. That's a lot better than this because I talk about the last 7 founders I published on my website. It's fresh in my mind. It's things I've learned just this week. So that's a lot of fun. And on Fridays, we play trivia, which is also a lot of fun. Snow falling off the roof. So yeah, definitely subscribe. If you enjoyed this chat, then you'll enjoy the other ones, which are better. So thank you guys so much for coming. I'm going to sign off. I forget the sign-off phrase for Sunday. That's okay, because we're going to go and we're going to be interviewing Michael Troy from the AmRev podcast, the American Revolution podcast, which is amazing. And if you like this and you need something to listen to because you can't watch, he's going chronologically through the American Revolution. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's my favorite thing to listen to, so definitely check that out. Come back tomorrow. We're going to talk about him and the Continental Navy and invading Britain just tomorrow. We could do this on Discord. That's a great idea. Now, I did not put the Discord link in. Matt, you are brilliant. Joanna, there is a thing called Discord, which I don't know if you are familiar with or not. It's kind of like a social media platform, but it's just ours. It is just Founder of the Day. Here, I am going to paste. Is this the link? I hope this works. That is a personal invite just for you, Joanna. It's essentially like Facebook, but it's my server. So it's only people who got access through me. We talk about the American Revolution there. We have a reading of the week there. We have, sometimes people can put up announcements and events there. We have a fun chat. All American Revolution all the time. It makes me dark, though. I will be light again. It's a lot of fun. Definitely check it out. But yeah, Matt, that's a great idea. We can have this chat on Discord, because essentially that's what the Discord is for. Well, we have a meme section. That's silly. But just talking about the American Revolution when I'm not necessarily on camera. So definitely come hang out there. It's a lot of fun. That link only lasts for, yes, anyone else who's not Joanna, although there's not a whole ton of people here right now. That link only lasts 24 hours. So that's the way we keep it too, so there's not people just coming in being rude about it. But I can go live there too. So Matt, that's a great idea. Maybe we'll pick a day of the week where I can go live for the Q&A. Or maybe I say, yeah, I'll brainstorm a little bit. Next time I'll let you know. So thank you guys so much. We're a little bit over the hour. That's okay. It's fun. And I'm going to go. And like I said, tomorrow, Michael Troy's coming. So that's going to be great. I will see